Welcome to PragerU Live. I'm Jared Sechel, here today with Raymond Ibrahim, author of The Al-Qaeda Reader and Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War on Christians. He's also featured in two PragerU videos, The World's Most Persecuted Minority, Christians, which has 1.5 million views, and also Radical Islam, the Most Dangerous Ideology, with 2 million views. Raymond, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to PragerU Live.
Hi, Jared. Happy to be with you.
So I want to start with something that you actually point out in one of your PragerU videos, which is that in the early 20th century, in North Africa and the Middle East, Christians made up about 20% of the population. Today, that number is down to around 4%, and much of that loss has come in the last decade. So what in the world is going on?
Well, to understand that you're talking about the 20th century, we need to actually go back to the 7th century when North Africa and the Middle East, the greater Middle East, was almost 100% Christian in the 7th century. People forget places like Alexandria, Egypt, and Carthage in modern day Algeria, and Constantinople, which is Turkey now, and all these different original four of the five original founding sees. The only one that never got conquered was Rome. Were swallowed up by Islam. And so in the 7th century, when Islam, the great famous Arab conquests that we hear about, which are really Islamic conquests, went into all these lands that I just referred to and which we're talking about now, they were largely Christian, almost 100%, you can say. And so how did they get from 100 to 20% in the 20th century? And so it's the same exact answer because of the widespread persecutions, the dhimmi system, whereby those who want to stay Christians or Jews can do so, but they have to pay a special tax, and then they have to live according to all these debilitations and basically be third-class subjects who, at the whim of a ruler or at the whim of a mob can be attacked and so forth. So basically, almost 14 centuries of that, or 13 centuries, bringing us to the 20th century, saw what was once Christian majority become heavily Muslim majority. And then in the 20th century, as you pointed out, you had about 20% Christians. Now they're gone. They've dwindled to about 4 for the same exact reason, the same kind of persecutions that history records. And of course, most people in the West are not familiar with because it goes against the dominant narrative of Islam is peace. Same thing is still happening. They're being attacked, they're being butchered, they're being, we hear about ISIS or the Islamic State giving people 3 choices: convert, or again, pay tribute, or die, enslaving people, enslaving Christians, enslaving Yazidi women as concubines, and the same. So it's the same thing going on, and it's not just ISIS. You have to keep in mind other groups. Boko Haram in Nigeria is doing this. El Shabaab in Somalia. All these various groups all around are doing this, and it's not even just these well-known terrorist groups. It's actually Muslim mobs, Muslim individuals, Muslim rulers and regimes, such as in Iran and so forth, Saudi Arabia, friends and allies. All of this has seen what was once a Christian majority, in fact, the heart of Christendom in the 7th century, it wasn't Europe, as most people think, become what it is today, where now Christians are steadily dwindling, near extinct minority.
Well, it is very important for people to recognize it's not just terrorist groups. This was happening long before the Islamic State and Boko Haram and Al Qaeda. It's also whether it's explicit government persecution or the government allowing and encouraging Islamist mobs to terrorize Christian communities.
Yeah. You mentioned my book, Crucified Again. That book came out in 2013. That's before the Islamic State became, the Islamic State, the Caliphate, and all that. And that book, it's about 300 plus pages, is all same kinds of persecutions that you're familiar with from ISIS. And it's not ISIS. Not any of them are from ISIS. And till this very day, I produce a report every month for the Gatestone Institute. I've been doing it now going on 6 years, every month. So we're talking about, going on 70 or so reports. Each one of these reports has, 20, 25, 30 anecdotes of Muslim violence, persecution on Christians all around the world. And again, the vast majority of it is not at the hands of the Islamic State. It's, Muslim governments, Muslim individuals, Muslim criminals, Muslim mobs, and so forth. So yeah, it's a lot more entrenched and widespread, and hardly limited to these individual terrorist groups who, as we're told, have nothing to do with Islam.
You say that you say in one of your PragerU videos that if the situation were flipped and Christians were doing to Muslims, what Muslims are doing to Christians in the Middle East and North Africa, this would be considered the human rights tragedy of our time. What do you mean by that?
I mean, I just mentioned these reports I write, and every month I do, and 20, 25, sometimes 30 different anecdotes. The vast majority of those are not in any way, shape, or form heard in the Western media. They appear, just on very small, sporadic human right type media. A lot of them are never even make it into the English language. I translate them. A lot of them I bring them and translate them to English from Arabic and other languages. And my point is, all these very unknown stories, any one of those, if it was a Christian or a Jew or just a non-Muslim in general, but specifically a Western kind of person doing this to Muslims, any one of those, it would be just all over plastered the news, and everyone would know about it. It would be a great tragedy. And yet what you see is 25, 30 such anecdotes happening every single month. Churches being attacked, bombed, burned, people being killed, Christians being held hostage, women and children being raped, enslaved, everything you can imagine that ISIS does happening, and it just doesn't even make it. People don't know about it. So that's why I say what I said, which is it's the human rights tragedy, and it's the one that nobody knows, and the double standards are so obvious because, like I said, based on how any little thing, just what people say, just criticism of Islam is huge news here in the West, whereas people are being slaughtered left and right by Islam, and that people don't even know about it.
The American press seems to give very little attention to the ethnic cleansing of Christians, as you just said. But when there's an alleged Islamophobic incident in the United States, like the fabricated incident with the clock boy in Texas, when he actually did bring something into the school that really did look like a bomb, and the press was saying, no, it's because he has a Muslim name and he's Muslim, that it was these Americans who are terrified of Muslims did this. So why is it that journalists in the U.S. will freak out about relatively minor incidents and will give very little attention to actual ethnic cleansing?
Well, first and foremost, because they're not journalists, they're propagandists, and their job is to maintain the narrative. There's a narrative that's been created which bears little resemblance to reality. This narrative is that the big bad evil force is Western people, European people, white people, Christian people. That's the evil side. And all the innocent people who are suffering are non-Christians, non-Europeans, non-Westerners, the oppressed other, Muslims, for example. So that's the narrative. So that's why everything we've talked about so far, how these things are not making it to light, is because it goes against the narrative. We can't to keep talking and showing and exposing Muslims in the name of Islam, persecuting minorities and killing and doing all sorts of atrocities, and including to Christians, who, again, if you go from a historical point of view, are the bad guys all the time because, the Inquisitions, the Crusades, both of which, of course, aren't even understood in their proper context. And so that's the narrative for these so-called journalists. And then when they find any incident that they can just blow up and make it so it fits with the narrative, which is here again we go with xenophobic Europeans, Westerners, white people, Christians being paranoid and critical of Muslims, and the Muslims are innocent and so forth, then they blow that out of a proportion and distort it, and that becomes the news 24/7, while people are being butchered left and right in the name of Islam, which no one hears because all of it distorts the narrative.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And there are a lot of so-called journalists out there, and the only difference I see between these quote-unquote so-called journalists and propagandists, explicit propagandists, is that propagandists are telling you the truth that they're trying to influence you, whereas journalists will say, no, truth's our number one agenda, but they actually have an agenda that's higher than truth, which is their narrative. And there are obviously many great journalists out there, but there are many really damaging ones. I used to be a journalist, and I'm for one, I'm very glad I got out of that field because it's really been breaking down in the last 6 to 12 months, particularly. So your family is originally from Egypt, Coptic Christians, if I'm not mistaken. So can you tell me what's the situation today for Copts in Egypt?
The situation for Copts in Egypt has it's reflective of the general situation for Christians under the Islamic world in general. That is to say, it's increasingly getting worse. In the time of my family, let's say when they were there in the 60s or growing up in the 40s and 50s, you had a lot of entrenched discrimination. Everyone knew that. The best jobs are going to be given to the Muslim, for instance, not the Christian. But they could live with that, cops and Christians. It was enough. You didn't have the kind of wholesale persecution, or if you did, it was very rare and very, just aberrant to the general situation back then. Today, you got it to the point just last month, for instance, and this again goes back to what we're talking about, which is how little of this is being reported. Just last month, and there were, I think, 6 separate incidences of Muslims killing Christians in Egypt, all around Egypt, Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt, in the Sinai Peninsula, and all these areas. All of them were hate crimes. One of them was simply, and it's caught on camera, just an Egyptian Coptic Christian who owns a liquor store, which are legal in Egypt. And he's just sitting on a chair outside his shop, and he has a camera, so it's videotaping. And a Muslim man, and obviously the pious Salafi variety, has a long beard, no mustache, the way Muhammad told them to grow their facial hair, because he said, clip your mustache so you don't look like Jews and Christians. You see him walking up behind him, he just slowly comes up, holds his head back, and just starts carving at his throat and kills him. Why? Because he was selling alcohol, which is haram. It goes against Sharia law. Even though it's okay, even Sharia law lets Christians and Jews drink alcohol and so forth. All of them were hate crimes, and yet not one of them made it into Western media. I translated them. I brought them up. And but the point is, you got like 6 that happened separately, and all of them were other people were just butchered. Some had like 80 stab wounds. Even the police admit it's hate crimes because of the religious identity. And these happened in like 10 days, 6 different crimes. So this is pretty much, compared to the time of my parents, it's a lot more dramatic, the persecution now. So it's just, and again, it's in tandem with the overall revival of Islam in the Islamic world. Much of it is being funded, of course, by petrodollars. Saudi Arabia spends about 100 billion every year to empower, to spread this ideology to Egypt and to the West, and to support people who actually, have their same vision. So,
to the extent that these stories are almost never covered in the Western press. This is unfortunately the first time I've heard of it. But to the extent that these stories are covered, the narrative is often, as far as it pertains to Islamist violence, is, well, Muslims have a lot of grievances and they're being victimized. That's the narrative. Is there truth to that?
Yes and no. I think a lot of Muslims around the world have a grievance, and a lot of them are violent because of this grievance. But this grievance has very little to do with our notion of grievances. It has nothing to do with fair treatment and equality. What it has to do with is Muslims being raised in this ideology that Islam is supreme, that everyone else is an infidel who has to live in a lowly manner beneath them, because this idea is all in their texts. It's in the Quran, which really refers to non-Muslims as cattle and chattel and just essentially non-human. And they're bred with this. So when they see for instance, very often a lot of these persecutions begin simply because a Christian or someone else actually stands up for his right, okay, or dares to do something that's considered equal to Islam. So in Pakistan, for instance, Christians were in a church singing, I think, Christmas carols. All of a sudden, there's a nearby mosque. Muslims barged in with axes, destroyed all the furniture, the cross, beat up the children, and said, "How dare you disturb us during our prayers?" So, from our point of view, there is no grievance. It's just 2 people, each one in their institution, trying to pray. From the Islamic view, it's how dare you do this, and so a lot of them, yes, are compelled by a sense of grievance, but it has nothing to do with what we think. And the best example is Israel. Okay, that is the greatest grievance to Muslims. How dare the Jews, the descendants of apes and pigs, according to the Quran, lord over Muslims in Muslim land as Muslims understand it. And so that drives them insane, even though if it was just a matter of equality and everyone has their own land, it's fine. And this kind of thing pops up everywhere. But then the Western media, as you were indicating, twist it to make it sound like it's they have grievances because their feelings are hurt and because people are killing Muslims. If you recall that Somali fellow who went on he crashed his car and went on a stabbing spree a few months ago. They went into his Facebook account and found that it sounded like he had a grievance. He was angry because Buddhists were killing Muslims, something like that. Now, how that means let's go kill Americans, I don't know. But they used it and they distorted it and they made it sound like he was
You
just
never need an
upset.
excuse to kill Americans.
Yeah, basically. I think viewers understand where I'm going with.
Yeah, well, I think you're exactly right, which is they do feel grievances, but that shows how different the cultures are. In our language and our understanding of right and wrong, there's nothing to feel aggrieved about. But in their understanding of right and wrong, the existence of an autonomous Jewish state is unacceptable, and that inherently, because it exists, that turns Muslims there into victims.
Exactly. Yeah.
Have Christian communities in the United States spoken up in defense of persecuted Christians in the Middle East the way that decades ago that Jewish communities helped fuel the Free Soviet Jewry movement?
Oh, no, not at all. Not in that sense.
Why not?
Uh, yeah, I mean, there's certainly you have a few Christian smaller groups that try to speak up, smaller individuals, smaller organizations, and so forth. But the larger ones, um, especially the Catholic ones and the more ecumenical ones, and I even forget what they're called, these large umbrella groups that bring in all these different denominations that are very powerful and receive government funding to help bring refugees and so forth. They're amongst the most adamant who just want to insist that Muslims are the greatest victims, and they don't at all mention Christians suffering under Islam at the hands of Muslims, and they very much downplay it. They're very much part of the general narrative and the agenda, and but certainly to no extent has anyone gone as far as what Jews used to do with the Soviet situation and so forth, which is very laudable, and one admires it because it shows how much they actually cared about their own, and they brought it to light. But in the Christian situation, it's much more fractured in general, and a lot of Western Christians in America and so forth are, like I said, clueless about what's even happening right now.
As it pertains to President Trump's executive order regarding travel, a lot of opponents of it said that he is giving preference to Christian refugees, and they criticized him for that. So first question would be, is that what he was doing with the executive order? And second, if Christians are being persecuted in the Middle East, and if they want to come to America, they want to be American, they're pro-American, is there an inherent problem in giving preference to those types of refugees?
So to your first question, I'd say no. He's not doing anything. He's not favoring in the sense in the way that his predecessor Obama was favoring. Under Obama, it was very clear that number one, the State Department even admitted that what was happening to Christians in the Middle East was genocide. They used that word, just like for Yazidis and so forth, but not for Sunni Muslims. But under Obama, something like 99% of those who were brought into America, refugees, were not just Muslims, but they were Sunnis. Now, the Islamic State does not go around burning Sunni mosques, enslaving Sunni women and children, beheading them, crucifying them, and so forth. It does that to Christians, does that to Yazidis, and so forth. But you found that there was, under Obama, something like from Syria, like I said, 99% or 99.5% were Sunni Muslims, and then the other 0.1%, some of it was Christian. And it came out basically that if he would have brought in the same amount of Christians as he did Muslims, just to be fair, okay, like same ratio, should have been bringing in something like 20 times the amount of Christians that came in. So he was taking in basically 5% of Christians relative to the amount that he was taking of Muslims. So Trump has actually pointed this out. He said basically what I just told you. And that's why he wants to right that wrong by bringing in Christians. But also he knows, as I've explained several times, that the Christians are actually being persecuted in a sense that they're being singled out for their religious identity and hounded just for that simple reason. The Sunnis that are coming, who are of the same exact sect that ISIS is a Sunni organization, are not being singled out in that way. Maybe they're fleeing just general chaos and so forth. But how can such people be deemed as needing sanctuary as ones who are being butchered because of their religious identity and who are being called genocide by the State Department? So that's for the first question. And as for your second question, I've actually been arguing that not only is it more humanitarian to bring in Christians and Yazidis, the actual real victims of genocide, who are victims of hate groups and so forth, but they actually bring benefits if you bring them in. One, they're more assimilate. They can assimilate better in Western societies. Why? Because they come from a Christian background, and whatever anyone wants to say, Western societies come from that background, and there's a lot of institutions and worldviews that are rooted to it, and that's why when you find a lot of Christians who come from the Middle East, they assimilate. They don't find anything strange, unlike Muslims who come and then they get angry because they see too much freedom in the West. They get angry because they, accuse people of being promiscuous and alcohol, and then they go on violence and so forth. So they at least assimilate. They have the same enemy. They know about persecution more than anyone in America. So they can be helpful. They can translate. They can help people learn the mentality of the Middle East and so forth. So you actually have benefits. You don't only help the true victims of actual genocide. You can actually feel safer because those who come in are not going to turn into jihadis because they're actual victims of jihadis, and they can bring in language benefits and cultural and other insights. And so I think it's a win-win, and I think and hope Trump understands this.
Well, the real problem in terms of people's views towards Christians from the Middle East getting some type of preference in immigration is the C word. It's that they're Christian, and so they're kind of on the wrong side of the political correctness spectrum. Right. If they just had some other, if they were just called religious group E, you say check. Are they a religious minority being persecuted by a religious majority? Yes, they are. Are they pro-American? Overwhelmingly, yes, they are. Will they be an asset to the United States as immigrants? Overwhelmingly, yes, they will be. The problem is they're called Christians, which is why there's so much controversy around giving them some type of preference.
Right. And that goes back to what I was saying, which is, there's this ingrained worldview that the bad guys are Christians. That's the narrative. They're never victims. They're the ones who persecute others. So how can we all of a sudden throw this narrative overboard and expose reality and show that they're actually the big victims? And by the way, many people don't know this, but one of the WikiLeaks was about Obama right before he became president, when he was running, I think, for president. And this WikiLeaks makes very clear that his cabinet was discriminating against Christians because the email, it's on my website and I can send it to you, but basically it's two of his aides are talking about how they want to have Muslims in the cabinet, but then they say, but this one's name is George and this one is this, so we know they're Christians, so keep an eye for people like that because we can't hire them. And and what's funny is Obama's the guy that when people brought this idea up of, well, Christians are actually being persecuted because of their identity, why don't we bring them in before we bring their persecutors, Sunni Muslims? He came up and started grandstanding about how that's not who we are, we're better than that, we don't actually single out different religions, and all the time that's exactly what he was doing.
Exactly. Do you see the Middle East and North Africa being a safe place for Christians in the foreseeable future, or is their future very much in doubt there?
I mean, it's again, if we step back and kind of the macro cosmic historical view, and you just watch the progression, it's we went from overwhelming majority of that area. Now there's 4%, 3%, whatever the number may be. So if things don't change in the foreseeable future, it's logical that they will be just snuffed out. They've been snuffed out in areas. When you hear about, countries like North Africa and Algeria and Morocco and so forth, if you look at the statistics, they say 99.9% Muslims. And then the very, very few Christians are usually Muslims who became Christian. So basically in those areas, it got to the point where Christianity was completely snuffed out. And this is actually, Carthage, they had a council in 380 something. And that council is what gave us the modern Bible that we have today with, the 66 books. That's how important that area was. That's how Christian it was, and its role in Christian history. Now it's done. So if you look at now, Egypt has a larger Christian population, something like 10%. But you have to keep in mind, Egypt in the 7th century was even way more Christian than Algeria or Carthage. Alexandria was one of the greatest sees, and all the great theologians came from there and so forth. And the hermit and the monastery movements came from there and so forth. So, but that has even been brought down to 10%. So basically, if things stay the way they are, nothing changes, then I assume Egypt will go the way of Algeria and Morocco.
Yeah, it certainly looks that way. And people have to remember that Jews have not always been in Israel. They used to be spread out all around the Middle East. Iraq had massive Jewish community. Egypt had a large Jewish community. But what Islamists are doing to Christians now, this was done to Jews for decades. And you have now basically Jews make up 0% of every country in the Middle East except for Israel and Iran as well. But they're almost basically just in Israel.
Well, it's, the famous Muslim saying, which they've been saying for centuries, is first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. The Saturday people, the Sabbath people, are the Jews. So they were the first to get the axe. And now it's the turn, of the Sunday people, the Christians.
So final question, Raymond. What can the United States do to improve the situation on the ground for Christians who are still in the Middle East?
Well, for starters, and this is usually what I argue with, is get the truth out. Start at least creating the true narrative, because unless you have the actual, unless you have the truth in front of you, how can we start even figuring out what to do? Well, we're always going to be stuck basically trying to put a square peg inside of a round hole, and which will lead to nothing. So at least get the reality and the truth out. It seems someone like Trump, definitely compared to his predecessors, all of them, is much better for that. He's very, frank and honest so far, the way he speaks about these topics. So that's definitely a plus. And then also be tough on all these, the leaders, our so-called allies, the people that America gives millions and billions to, Muslim leaders and so forth. What's so difficult about making this aid somewhat contingent on these leaders in these countries being a little humane to their minorities, the religious minorities? That would go a long way. But where we're at right now, under Obama and so forth, it's a non-topic. People, for instance, criticized Obama when he gave I don't know how many millions, or if it was billions, to Pakistan, and not one word about, for instance, someone like Asia Bibi, a Christian woman who's been on death row for 8 years because she was falsely accused of saying something offensive about Muhammad. And she's just one of Christians who's been suffering because of the blasphemy law of Pakistan, and it's in the same laws in Egypt, and it's being used against Copts and so forth. So a stronger stance from U.S. leadership would also go a long way, I think.
It's crazy that blasphemy laws are still a thing.
And what's funny is, in Pakistan and in Egypt, they both have it, but it's called anti-defamation of religions. And if you look at their the wording and their articles and the constitutions, they use the word religions in plural, and they specify that this is in regards to heavenly religion, meaning you can't blaspheme against Christianity or Judaism as well, because those are people of the book. And yet, anyone can with impunity say or do anything about Christianity and Judaism in these two countries, and they often do. Most recently, in Egypt, a governmental official who's also a Muslim cleric came on TV talking about how Muhammad is going to be married, and meaning he's going to be copulating with Saint Mary, the Virgin Mary, the mother of Christ, in heaven. And where did he get this idea from? From Muhammad, because there's a canonical hadith saying attributed to Muhammad, who says, when I'm in heaven, I will have her as one of my wives, basically one of his concubines. So he can say that, and Christians were angry and upset because they're Orthodox, and Mary holds a venerable position in that tradition. And of course, nothing happened to him. But when a little boy is just accused of an illiterate boy who maybe burns paper, and one of is a Quranic text, then they go insane, try to kill him, and if he doesn't get killed, he gets thrown in jail, and then he gets persecuted in his whole family, and so forth. So again, there's your double standards, and grievances. And, supposedly this is supposed to cover all religions. It doesn't. Once again, it's just for Islam.
And to your point, the United States government has leverage with these Muslim countries. We have leverage with Saudi Arabia, with Pakistan, with Egypt. We have massive defense contracts with them. We give foreign aid. So I think anyone who cares about the plight of Christians in the Middle East should hope that the United States government uses that leverage to negotiate with these governments to not allow this persecution to continue.
Absolutely. And again, if you want to be humanitarian, if you feel the need to bring in refugees, bring in the true refugees. Keep in mind, how many times have we heard that refugees sailing from North Africa and going to Italy end up throwing Christians out of their boat because they're Sunni Muslim. Are these the types of people that you think need sanctuary? People who throw out and drown people because they're Christians? Keep in mind, this is what's happening. Even in Europe and all these refugee camps, over and over, you get report of Christians being persecuted by the Muslim refugees around them, who of course make up the majority. So this is the mentality, a persecuting mentality, a supremacist mentality, a hostile mentality that people in the West are taking in and feeling sorry for and saying, we need to give you sanctuary and refuge. Give it to the people who are actually suffering at their hands.
Well, on that cheery note, Raymond, thank you so much for joining us. And for those watching, stick around. We're actually going to now screen Raymond's 2 PragerU videos. And Raymond Ibrahim, thank you again.
Thanks, Jared.
What is the world's most dangerous ideology? In the first part of the 20th century, the answer was fascism. First manifest in Italy in the 1920s, and then in Nazi Germany and in Imperial Japan. It took a world war and 50 million dead to stamp it out. In the second half of the 20th century, the answer was communism. Between the Soviet Union, Mao's China, and their client states, at least 100 million people were killed in its wake. Today, the answer is Islamism, a radical and often violent form of Islam. Like fascism and communism, Islamism is totalitarian in nature. The state controls everything. Also, like fascism and communism, Islamism is inherently expansionist. It always seeks to get bigger, cross borders, and bring as many peoples as possible under its control. And, like fascism and communism, many of Islamism's adherents are prepared to kill to achieve its aims. Those aims are antithetical to everything Western and other free societies stand for. Free speech, free enterprise, freedom to practice or not to practice any religion, freedom of assembly, a free press, and, of course, fundamental human and civil rights for all their citizens. Islamism completely rejects the Western principle of separating religion from government. In its view, governments are legitimate only if they rule according to religious law, in Islamism's case, Sharia, Islam's extensive body of sacred laws. Sharia is based on the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah. The Quran is believed to be the literal words of Allah as revealed to his prophet Muhammad in the 7th century, and the Sunnah consists of the words and deeds attributed to Muhammad. Islamists interpret Sharia to hold that anyone born Muslim must remain Muslim and face execution if they convert to any other religion, that adulterers must be stoned to death, that anyone who insults Islam or Muhammad must either be severely whipped or executed, and that thieves should have a limb cut off. In addition, Islamists condone polygamy and child marriage. These beliefs are being put into practice right now in, among other places, Iran, the Sudan, Saudi Arabia, the Muslim parts of Nigeria, parts of Pakistan, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and wherever else Sharia has established a foothold. If Islamists were content to live under strict Sharia law in their own communities and leave everyone who doesn't want to live that way alone, they wouldn't be a threat to the rest of the world. But that would not be Islamism. Islamism wants the entire world governed by Sharia, and anyone who opposes Islamist expansionism is the enemy and must be destroyed. That, of course, includes the United States, all of Europe, and Israel. But it also includes fellow Muslims. Indeed, Islamists have killed far more Muslims than members of any other group. So how many Islamists are there? Nobody knows for sure, but we can make some conservative calculations. There are approximately 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. How many of these are Islamists? A 2013 Pew Research poll offers some clues. 86% of Muslims in Pakistan, 80% in Egypt, and 65% in Jordan support the stoning of adulterers. 79% in Afghanistan, 62% of Palestinians, and 58% in Malaysia, considered a moderate Muslim country, support the death penalty for Muslims who convert from Islam. If only 10% of the world's Muslims are Islamists, and the percentage is likely higher, that's 150 million people. Among these, how many are willing to take violent action to enforce their Islamism? Here we're talking about Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, the Taliban, Hamas, Hezbollah, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and other groups that send suicide bombers into markets, explode car bombs at funerals, throw acid in the faces of girls who attend school, murder sisters or daughters who defy the will of a brother or father, or who fly hijacked airplanes into buildings. This is a very hard number to pin down. So let's again be cautious and say the figure is only 2% of that 150 million. That's still 3 million people, 3 million potential terrorists organized by a common ideology and supported by many more. The good news is that hundreds of millions of Muslims are not radical Islamists. Just to cite one example, the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood governed Egypt for 1 year in 2012. But enough Egyptians were so outraged by the Brotherhood's harsh imposition of Sharia law that they staged perhaps the largest demonstrations in human history against the Muslim Brotherhood and brought that government down. Since the beginning of the 20th century, every generation has been confronted with a lethal threat to freedom and fundamental human rights. Free people defeated the last two totalitarian threats, fascism and communism. If we want to preserve freedom, we, non-Muslims and Muslims alike, will have to defeat the threat of our time, Islamism. I'm Raymond Ibrahim, author of the Al-Qaeda Reader for PragerU University. A decline has occurred in the last decade. In essence, Muslims are rendering North Africa and the Middle East free of Christians. Take Egypt, for example, my ancestral homeland. In just the past 2 years, tens of thousands of Christian Copts have left Egypt, and many others want to leave, but they simply cannot afford to. Why they want to leave is no mystery. On New Year's Day, 2011, the Two Saints Church in Alexandria was bombed, leaving 23 Copts dead and 97 injured. In recent years, dozens of Coptic churches have been attacked, many burned to the ground. In August 2013 alone, the Muslim Brotherhood and its supporters attacked and destroyed some 80 churches. Unfortunately, Egypt is more the rule than the exception. Hundreds of Nigerian churches have been destroyed in recent years, with especially deadly attacks reserved for Christmas and Easter church services, leaving dozens dead or mutilated. Churches have been bombed or burned in Iraq, Syria, and just about every place in the Middle East where churches still exist, except Israel. Christian businesses have been torched, Christian girls have been kidnapped, sold as child brides or slaves, and had acid thrown in their faces for not being veiled. Anyone born a Muslim who converts to Christianity faces jail and possibly execution. The list of fresh atrocities by Muslims against Christians grows longer almost every day. Even in Muslim countries often portrayed as moderate, Morocco, Indonesia, Malaysia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Christian minorities are under legal pressure not to build churches or evangelize. The Christians in these Muslim countries are often identical to their co-citizens in race, ethnicity, national identity, culture, and language. There is no political dispute between the Christians and Muslims, no land dispute. Vastly outnumbered and politically marginalized, these Christians simply wish to worship in peace. Instead, they are hounded and attacked. So then, why is this happening? And why is the media making so little mention of it? The first question is easy to answer. Christians are being persecuted in Muslim countries because they're Christians, or as the Quran puts it, infidels. That is, non-Muslims who are regarded by many fundamentalist Muslims as inferior. As a fundamentalist interpretation of the holy books of Islam has grown in the last 50 or so years, Christians have suffered, and in recent years they have suffered terribly. I document this in my book, Crucified Again, Exposing Islam's New War on Christians. If this were happening to any other group besides Christians, it would be the human rights tragedy of our time. There would be loud worldwide calls for action. But the silence in the mainstream Western media is, as they say, almost deafening. Why? Because Muslim persecution of Christians throws a wrench in the media's narrative that Muslim violence is a product of Muslim grievance. That grievance is, first and foremost, portrayed as the sin of European colonialism and alleged American imperialism. In the Muslim world's mind, those two sins are personified by the Jewish state of Israel, a nation the Muslim world believes was forced upon it by the colonial powers of Europe following World War II and is currently supported by the United States. Much of the Western world and the Western media have largely bought at least some of this narrative. Here's how it works. Because Israel, with the backing of the United States, is stronger than its Muslim neighbors, the media, while not defending Islamic terrorism, often portray terror against Israel, America, and even Europe as the actions of understandably angry underdogs fighting for what they deem justice. But what happens to this media narrative when Islamic terror is directed against a minority weaker than them? In this case, the millions of indigenous Christians throughout the Islamic world. The answer is that, rather than abandon this narrative, the media just don't report Muslim persecution of Christians, except for the most sensational cases. That's why you probably don't know that there are barely any Christians living in Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, nations where Christianity once thrived, or that this is happening in Egypt, Iraq, Iran, and even Lebanon. So yes, Christians are indeed the most persecuted religious group in the world today, but reporting it would violate the media's narrative of Christians as persecutors and Muslims as victims. I'm Raymond Ibrahim, author of the Al-Qaeda Reader for PragerU University.